It's pretty much 9 years ago that I learnt that one of my great heroes had just died. A man, a writer and a speaker by the name of Brennan Manning. Brennan's life was, in one sense, a catalogue of disasters. He was raised in a pretty abusive home, and after completing military service, he became a Franciscan priest. But then he got married, which is tricky for a Roman Catholic priest. And then he got divorced, which is even worse. Also, he was an alcoholic, something he struggled with all his life. And yet this wonderful, fallible human being understood the grace of God better than anyone else that I've ever come across. Philip Yancey, who wrote the book What's So Amazing About Grace, says this about Brennan. More than once I have watched this leprechaun of an Irish Catholic hold spellbound an audience of thousands by telling in a new and personal way the story that all of us want to hear, that the Maker of all things loves and forgives us. Brennan knows well that love, and especially the forgiveness. In the introduction to perhaps his most famous book, Brennan Manning says this: "This book was written for the bedraggled, beat up and burnt out. It's for the sorely burdened who are still shifting the heavy suitcase from one hand to the other. It is for the wobbly and weak-kneed who know they don't have it all together and are too proud to accept the handout of amazing grace. It is for inconsistent, unsteady disciples whose cheese is falling off their cracker. It is for poor, weak, sinful men and women with hereditary faults and limited talents. It is for earthen vessels who shuffle along on feet of clay. It is for the bent and the bruised who feel that their lives are a grave disappointment to God. It is for smart people who know that they are stupid, and honest disciples who admit that they are scallywags." Now, as someone for whom the cheese is often falling off their cracker, I warm to that kind of introduction. It was Brennan who said beautifully and succinctly that God loves us as we are and not as we should be, because none of us is as we should be. And it is that love, that grace, that is at the heart of our gospel reading today. The reading all hangs on one man, Peter, and on his response to Jesus. Peter was a proud man. I guess early on he was motivated by that pride. Jesus, this great prophet and teacher, who Peter had correctly identified as the Messiah, had chosen only 3 people to be with him at the most crucial moments: James and John, the ambitious ones, and Peter. Peter was highly favoured. At the Last Supper, Peter's sense of pride was clear. He would not let Jesus, his master, wash his feet. And then later, when Jesus was arrested, Peter reacted again to Jesus being humiliated. He cut off a man's ear with his sword. Peter was a proud man who clearly wanted to succeed as a follower, as a disciple of Jesus. But Peter made mistakes. He got things wrong. When Jesus was taken away, someone recognized Peter as being one of Jesus' followers, but Peter denied it angrily. Poor Peter didn't have much to be proud of now. Maybe that's why he went fishing. Jesus had appeared to the disciples. That all happens in chapter 20 of John's Gospel. Why, if he'd seen the risen Lord, did Peter go back to the nets that he'd left when he decided to follow Jesus? Perhaps it was a trip for old time's sake, but I doubt it. Perhaps he was just confused. That's probably true. Perhaps he just wanted to go back to the security and the comfort of the familiar. He knew what he was about when he was fishing. He couldn't let people down in the same way that he had done. He was back where he belonged, back in control. But what made things worse for Peter is that now he couldn't even get the fishing right. They'd been fishing all night and hadn't caught a thing. You can feel the tiredness and the darkness and the frustration and perhaps the tetchiness between tired men on a dark night in a cold boat. Even the familiar had betrayed Peter. I'm sure the others in the boat must have wanted to go back, But for Peter, it was as though this was all that there was. To fail at this would be to fail at life itself. So they kept on. Then something remarkable happens. There's a man on the shore, and he's shouting. With his help, they catch a huge haul of fish, and then they twig. It is the Lord. Peter dives into the water and swims fairly inelegantly to the shore. There is Jesus, whom Peter denied, and Jesus is next to a charcoal fire. Peter had stood next to a charcoal fire when he denied knowing Jesus. You see, Jesus is not just brushing Peter's failure under the carpet and pretending it never happened. That helps no one. Because in anyone other than Jesus, those suppressed feelings would lead to bitterness and resentment. And Peter would never know where he stood. And if Peter's failure had never been mentioned, then Peter would never have felt forgiven. He'd have never been released from his guilt. When we fail, Jesus meets us at that point of failure. He doesn't say, right, that's it, you've let me down big time now. You've blown your chance of serving me. He doesn't get angry and vow to be ever disapproving, reinforcing in us the feeling that we were not good enough, that we are not good enough, that we just don't make the grade. And he doesn't think any less of us because we have failed. He knows how we punish ourselves. He doesn't want to add to that punishment. Jesus just gently confronted Peter with a charcoal fire, a reminder of his failure, but said by this offer of hospitality, you see, Peter, I still love you. I know you've let me down. I always knew you would. But don't you see, I love you despite your failure. Well, that was halfway there. But Peter must have felt gutted. He had let everyone down. Acceptance, love was not enough. Peter had lost his place on the team. There was no way that Jesus could use a failure like him. But after they'd finished their meal, Jesus took Peter for a walk. Just imagine how he felt when Jesus addressed him not as Peter, the strong rock, the firm, solid one, but as Simon, son of John. Peter hadn't exactly been very rock-like recently. Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? The question's ambiguous and Jesus doesn't make himself any clearer. Do you love me more than these could mean, do you love me more than these others do? Or it could mean, do you love me more than you love these others? Or it could be, do you love me more than these other things? The fishing, the boats, the being with friends. Do you love me more than these others do? St. Paul talks of outdoing one another in showing honour and not lagging in zeal. Peter himself had said that even if the others deserted Jesus, he would not desert him. Was he still so confident? Could he claim to love Jesus more than others? Do you love me more than these? Perhaps Peter was asked if his love for Jesus was greater than his love for his friends. That's a question about priorities, and it's a hard one to answer. To love Jesus more than we love others means putting him before all else. It means worshipping him in church when we could be doing other things. It means standing up for our faith and the things that we believe in, even when such a stand is unpopular. It means spending as much time with Jesus as possible in prayer, in worship, in the study of scriptures, and in our sharing in his work. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Perhaps Jesus wanted to know if Peter loved him more than he loved his boat, more than he loved fishing, more than he loved the comfort and the security of the familiar. The Christian cannot serve God if there are other things in their life which take priority over this. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Simon, son of John, do you love me? Simon, son of John, do you love me? 3 times Jesus asked him. 3 times Peter had denied him, and 3 times He now has to reassure Jesus of his love. "Yes, Lord," said Peter, "you know that I love you." And then Jesus explained what all this questioning was leading up to. Peter said, "Jesus, I want you to feed my lambs. I want you to tend my sheep. Peter, feed my sheep." You see, he was on a team. His failure hadn't counted against him. In fact, and this is the glorious truth about Easter, God can take our failures, even our big, huge failures, and redeem them. "Feed my lambs," said Jesus. You see, Peter was human, fallible. He had feet of clay like the rest of us. And when the crunch came, he let fear and maybe pride rule his heart. He disowned Jesus and turned his back on him. But in this wonderful encounter, Peter realizes that he's not burnt his bridges because there are some bridges that you just can't burn. Peter realized that God loves us as we are and not as we should be, because none of us is as we should be. And it was that grace, that amazing grace, that not only formed the content of Peter's preaching, but it shaped the character of his life. This once proud and headstrong man considered himself unworthy of dying in the same manner as Jesus, and so he was crucified upside down. Clearly, it was not pride that motivated Peter in his later life. Peter had been changed, transformed, and he'd learned that failure, even a spectacular failure such as his, was not enough to get you thrown off the team. Peter had let Jesus down, and not just once, but time and time again. But Jesus did not judge him harshly, nor did he dismiss him from his company. Instead, Jesus took Peter and used him, faults and all. I think many of us hold back from doing all that we would do because of feelings of unworthiness or guilt, or we feel that our lives are just a huge disappointment to God. But that's not how Jesus sees you. He loves you. It's you. He loves you. And if you love him, then he wants you to feed his lambs. Take care of his sheep. Feed his sheep. And that means every single one of us, loved, forgiven, and with a task, a purpose, a place on the team. Every single one of us. No exceptions. Philip Yancey, who wrote the book What's So Amazing About Grace, said this of Brennan Manning. "Brennan reminded me of the whiskey priest in Graham Greene's great novel The Power and the Glory. Though we never learn the priest's name, he considers himself a failure, a fool who loves all the wrong things. At the end of the book, we meet those who have been changed, transformed even by this priest's life and witness." It is extraordinary, reading these verses from John's Gospel, to then contemplate what Peter went on to be, the first great leader of the worldwide church. But it's no less extraordinary to think that the great God of heaven and earth should look on ragamuffins like us and not only declare his undying love for each one of us, but also to say to every one of us, "Come on, there's work to be done. I've chosen you. You're on the team."